The brutal August of 1843 descended upon Charleston with a heat that seemed to rise from the cobblestones themselves and that made the elegant townhouses along the Battery feel like elaborate ovens designed to bake their inhabitants into submission. Temperatures climbing to levels that drove those white families wealthy enough to afford such escapes to retreats in the North Carolina mountains or to seaside locations where ocean breezes provided relief, while enslaved people who maintained households and businesses remained behind to endure conditions that killed the vulnerable and that tested the endurance of even those most acclimated to the Low Country's deadly summers. In the kitchens and carriage houses and workrooms where enslaved people employed in Charleston's urban households gathered during the brief respites that domestic services demanding routines occasionally allowed. In the markets and along the wharves where enslaved laborers who were hired out by their owners to work for merchants and shipping companies maintained the commercial operations that sustained the city's extraordinary wealth built upon rice and cotton cultivation in surrounding plantation districts, and in the careful conversations that occurred in places where people who understood the enormous importance of discretion could speak with relative freedom about matters that public discussion would make dangerous for everyone involved. There circulated a story about a situation that had been developing over more than a decade at one of Charleston's most prominent households. A situation involving someone whose presence had become so integral to the family's operations and whose economic value had become so substantial that his eventual death 7 months earlier in January of 1843 had created a crisis that the family was still struggling to resolve in ways that revealed uncomfortable truths about slavery's economic foundations and about the complicated relationships that sometimes developed between enslaving families and particular enslaved individuals whose capabilities made them essentially irreplaceable despite slavery's ideology that insisted human beings were fungible property, whose loss could be readily compensated through purchase of equivalent replacements in markets that offered constant supply. According to accounts that were preserved with remarkable consistency across multiple generations in oral histories maintained by Charleston's free black community, and by descendants of enslaved people who had worked in households throughout the city, and who recognized that what had occurred at the Middleton residence represented something extraordinary that demonstrated both slavery's brutal exploitation and the complicated economic dependencies that the system created. A man named Josiah, who stood 7 feet and 6 inches tall according to measurements that had been carefully documented because his extraordinary size had commercial implications that the family who owned him understood and exploited systematically, had been purchased in 1830 by merchant Thomas Middleton specifically because his physical capabilities could generate revenues through hiring out arrangements that would far exceed what typical enslaved workers commanded in Charleston's robust market for rented labor. Josiah's size and strength made him capable of performing work that normally required multiple men, moving cargo on the wharves that lined Charleston Harbor where ships from throughout the Atlantic world arrived with manufactured goods and departed with cotton and rice, loading and unloading the massive hogsheads of rice and bales of cotton that constituted the exports sustaining Charleston's position as one of the wealthiest cities in North America. Operating machinery and equipment in warehouses and mills, where his capabilities allowed him to perform tasks that would otherwise require teams of workers whose combined wages would exceed what a single worker, however capable, could generate. The hiring out system that Thomas Middleton developed around Josiah's capabilities represented slavery's economic logic, operating with particular clarity and efficiency. Middleton paid for Josiah's food, clothing, and minimal housing while collecting fees from merchants and warehouse operators who rented his labor on terms that generated annual revenues approaching $500 according to fragmentary financial records that survived in Middleton family papers. Revenues that far exceeded the annual costs of maintaining him, and that within just a few years recouped the $1,500 that his purchase had cost, while continuing to generate substantial income year after year as long as his health and strength persisted. The arrangement created a situation where Josiah's economic value to the Middleton family came not from his integration into their household operations or from his labor on any plantation they might own, but rather from his placement into Charleston's labor markets, where his extraordinary capabilities commanded premium rates that merchants were willing to pay because his productivity exceeded what multiple typical workers could achieve, and because the efficiency gains his capabilities provided translated into competitive advantages for businesses that employed him. But the hiring out arrangement also created complicated dynamics that deviated in significant ways from how slavery typically functioned in domestic or plantation contexts. Josiah worked not under the direct supervision of owners who knew him personally, and who exercised daily control over every aspect of his existence, but rather under temporary supervision of merchants and warehouse operators who hired his labor for specific periods and who cared about his productivity, but who had no long-term investment in his well-being beyond the duration of their rental arrangements, and who therefore might work him with an intensity that would destroy his health over time in ways that owners with long-term economic interests in maintaining property value might avoid. The system meant that Josiah encountered numerous different supervisors and work environments across years, that he navigated Charleston's commercial districts with a degree of autonomous movement that enslaved people working in more controlled domestic or plantation environments never experienced, and that he developed knowledge and relationships across the city that created a kind of mobility and social capital that was unusual for enslaved people, but that the hiring out system's economics made inevitable, and that the Middleton family tolerated because restricting his movement would have interfered with the revenue generation that made him so economically valuable. The relationships that developed between Josiah and the various merchants and business operators who regularly hired his labor apparently evolved over the 13 years between his purchase in 1830 and his death in January 1843 into something more complicated than the purely exploitative relationships that slavery's normal operations involved. Multiple accounts preserved in oral traditions describe how certain merchants came to depend on Josiah's capabilities to such an extent that they arranged long-term agreements with the Middleton family for preferential access to his labor during seasons when shipping and warehousing operations were most intensive. How some employers apparently came to value not just his physical strength, but also his intelligence and reliability in ways that led them to entrust him with responsibilities that went beyond simple manual labor to include coordination of work crews and management of loading operations, where his judgment about weight distribution and cargo arrangement protected valuable goods from damage. These evolving relationships created a situation where Josiah possessed a kind of practical authority in commercial contexts that contradicted slavery's ideological insistence on Black people's inherent incapability for anything beyond the most basic labor under constant white supervision, where his knowledge and capabilities made him valuable in ways that transcended the simple physical strength that his size provided, and where the merchants who employed him came to recognize his economic importance to their operations in ways that created incentives for treatment that was less brutal than slavery typically imposed, even while the fundamental relationship remained one of exploitation and commodification. The Middleton family's relationship with Josiah also apparently evolved in complicated ways across the 13 years that he generated such substantial revenues for them, while they never acknowledged any obligation beyond the minimal provision of food and shelter and clothing that maintaining valuable property required. While they continued to collect the entirety of the fees that his labor commanded, without providing him with any portion of the revenues his capabilities generated beyond the subsistence that kept him capable of continuing to work. There developed, according to multiple accounts, what might be described as a recognition of his extraordinary value that manifested in treatment that was better than what many enslaved people in Charleston experienced, even if such treatment remained fundamentally exploitative and never approached anything resembling justice or fair compensation for labor that was generating enormous value for others. The Middletons apparently provided better food and housing than many Charleston slaveholders offered to those they held, apparently allowed him limited autonomy in how he spent time when not hired out to merchants, and most significantly, according to accounts that were preserved in oral traditions, apparently began to recognize that his economic value was so substantial and so difficult to replace through purchase of any typical enslaved worker that they needed to take measures to protect this investment in ways that went beyond how they might have treated more readily replaceable property. This recognition of irreplaceability became dramatically evident in January of 1843, when Josiah died suddenly at age approximately 43, from causes that accounts describe variably as heart failure or as complications from an injury sustained while moving cargo on the wharves. His death creating an immediate economic crisis for the Middleton family, whose annual income had come to depend substantially on the revenues his hiring out generated, and who discovered upon his death that replacing those revenues through hiring out any typical enslaved worker or even multiple workers was essentially impossible, given that his extraordinary capabilities had commanded fees that reflected his unique value, rather than merely compensating for standard labor that was widely available in Charleston's extensive slave markets. The crisis deepened as the Middletons attempted to find solutions that would restore the income stream that Josiah's labor had generated. They inquired among slave traders about purchasing someone of comparable size and strength, only to discover that such individuals were extraordinarily rare and that even when available commanded prices that far exceeded what typical workers cost, because traders understood that buyers willing to pay premium prices for extraordinary capabilities had specific purposes that made such acquisitions valuable enough to justify whatever costs might be involved. They attempted to hire out multiple workers to the merchants who had previously employed Josiah, only to find that even combined labor of several men could not fully replace his productivity, and that merchants who had become accustomed to his capabilities were unwilling to pay comparable total fees for less efficient alternatives. And they explored various other arrangements, including attempting to reconfigure their own economic activities in ways that would compensate for the loss of income that his death had created, only to recognize that the revenues his labor had generated had become so integral to their household finances that any significant reduction would require lifestyle adjustments that they found unacceptable. The merchants and warehouse operators who had regularly hired Josiah's labor experienced their own forms of disruption from his death that revealed how dependent their operations had become on capabilities that they had assumed would remain available indefinitely, but that proved impossible to replace through any normal hiring arrangements. The efficiency and productivity that his work had provided had created competitive advantages that allowed certain businesses to process cargo faster or to handle heavier loads with fewer workers than competitors could match. Advantages that translated into higher profits and better service that attracted customers, and that now disappeared with his death in ways that affected bottom lines and market positions that business operators had built around assumptions about resource availability that turned out to be far more fragile than they had recognized. Multiple accounts describe how certain merchants who had depended heavily on Josiah's capabilities struggled in the months following his death to maintain productivity levels that their customers had come to expect. How some had to hire additional workers at costs that eliminated profit margins that his labor had generated. And how the broader commercial community in Charleston came to recognize through these disruptions just how economically significant one person's extraordinary capabilities had been, even in a city where thousands of enslaved people performed the labor that sustained commerce, and where the assumption that workers were readily replaceable through market purchases was fundamental to how slavery's economics were understood. The Middleton family's extended struggle to resolve the financial crisis that Josiah's death created, a struggle that, according to fragmentary evidence in family papers and in letters written by Charleston residents who observed the family's difficulties, continued for at least 2 years following his death, and that may have contributed to eventual financial pressures that forced the family to sell their Charleston townhouse and to relocate to more modest circumstances, revealed uncomfortable truths about slavery's economic foundations that the system's defenders preferred not to acknowledge too explicitly or to examine too carefully. The ideology that justified slavery insisted that enslaved people were property equivalent to any other capital asset that could be readily replaced through market purchases when circumstances required. That individual enslaved people possessed no unique value beyond their general physical capabilities that determined their market price according to age and sex and health and skills that were common enough to be evaluated through standardized assessments. And that relationships between slaveholders and those they held as property remained purely economic transactions, where sentiment and individual recognition had no place, and where loss of any particular individual could be readily compensated through acquisition of equivalent replacements available in markets that offered abundant supply. But the Middleton family's experience with Josiah and the extended crisis that followed his death demonstrated that this ideology concealed more complicated realities, that individual enslaved people could possess capabilities that were genuinely extraordinary and essentially irreplaceable through normal market mechanisms, that economic activities and family finances could become dependent on particular individuals in ways that made their loss genuinely catastrophic rather than merely inconvenient, that the assumption of fungibility that underlay slavery's commodification of human beings did not actually describe reality when exceptional individuals generated value that far exceeded what typical workers could provide, and that acknowledging these truths too explicitly threatened to undermine the fundamental premise that enslaved people were property rather than persons whose individual capabilities and characteristics mattered in ways that property should not matter, according to legal and economic theories that needed enslaved people to remain conceptually interchangeable in order to function smoothly. The broader Charleston community's response to the situation that unfolded at the Middleton household following Josiah's death included various forms of discussion and reflection that revealed complicated attitudes about slavery's economics and about the relationships that sometimes developed between enslaving families and particular enslaved individuals who became economically indispensable. Some members of Charleston's elite expressed private sympathy for the Middletons' financial difficulties, while maintaining public performances of confidence that slavery's normal market mechanisms would eventually provide solutions to what they characterized as a temporary disruption. Others used the situation as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing one's economic security to become too dependent on any particular enslaved worker, whose death or illness or escape could create vulnerabilities that diversified labor arrangements would avoid. Still others recognized in the Middletons' crisis confirmation of arguments they had been making about slavery's economic inefficiencies and about the ways that treating human beings as property created distortions and complications that free labor systems avoided by allowing workers themselves to make decisions about how their capabilities would be deployed rather than creating. Situations where capital was locked into human assets whose loss through death or disability could not be insured against or compensated for through any of the normal mechanisms that protected other forms of property investment. The free Black community in Charleston and the enslaved people who worked in urban households observed the situation with perspectives shaped by intimate knowledge of slavery's operations and by recognition of what Josiah's story revealed about the system's fundamental contradictions, his extraordinary economic value to the Middleton family and to the merchants who had hired his labor, demonstrated that enslaved people's capabilities and contributions far exceeded the minimal compensation that slavery provided in the form of subsistence food and shelter and clothing, that the wealth that slaveholders accumulated came from systematic exploitation of labor that generated value many times greater than the costs of maintaining those whose work created such value, and that the ideology of fungibility that treated enslaved people as readily replaceable property concealed the reality that individual human capabilities varied dramatically, and that exceptional individuals could not be replaced through simple market purchases, regardless of how much capital might be available for such acquisitions. The fact that the Middleton family faced genuine financial crisis from losing revenues that one person's labor had generated, while that person and his family had received only minimal subsistence during years of work that created such substantial wealth for others, illustrated the fundamental injustice that characterized slavery regardless of whatever rationalizations about paternalistic care or mutual obligations defenders of the system offered. The story also provoked reflection among those who observed it about the complicated question of what genuine replacement would have meant. The Middletons sought to replace Josiah's labor through hiring out other enslaved workers or through purchasing someone of comparable physical capabilities. But what made him irreplaceable was not merely his size and strength, but rather the combination of physical capabilities. Intelligence, reliability, judgment, and accumulated knowledge and relationships that had developed across 13 years of working throughout Charleston's commercial districts. A combination that could not be acquired through any market transaction, regardless of price, because such qualities developed through experience and through individual character, rather than being inherent attributes that could be evaluated and purchased. The recognition that genuine replacement was impossible, because what made Josiah valuable went far beyond the physical characteristics that slave markets assessed and priced, revealed how inadequate slavery's commodification of human beings actually was for capturing the full reality of what individuals contributed through their labor and their capabilities. The eventual resolution of the Middleton family's crisis apparently involved combinations of adjustments that cumulatively addressed the financial pressures that Josiah's death had created, but that never fully restored the revenues his labor had generated. They hired out multiple enslaved workers they owned to various employers at rates that collectively approximated, though never quite matched, what Josiah alone had earned. They economized in various aspects of household expenditure to compensate for reduced income. They apparently borrowed against other assets to cover immediate shortfalls, while hoping that circumstances would eventually improve. And they gradually accepted that the extraordinary income stream that his labor had provided for more than a decade was simply gone, and could not be recreated through any combination of arrangements they could construct. The financial stress that these adjustments involved apparently contributed to eventual decisions to sell their Charleston townhouse and to relocate to less expensive circumstances, though whether this was directly caused by the crisis following Josiah's death or whether other factors contributed to financial decline remains unclear from available evidence. The longer-term impact of the story as it circulated through Charleston's enslaved and free Black communities and as it was preserved in oral traditions across generations, involved both specific lessons about the economic realities that underlay slavery's operations and broader reflections about the humanity and individuality that the system worked desperately to deny. Through its insistence that enslaved people were property rather than persons, the specific economic details demonstrated how valuable individual labor could be when capabilities were extraordinary. And when circumstances allowed that value to be captured and measured through the hiring out system's market mechanisms, providing concrete evidence that could counter claims that enslaved people contributed only minimal value that justified the minimal compensation that slavery provided. The broader reflection concerned the fundamental contradiction between slavery's ideology that treated human beings as fungible property and the reality that individuals possessed unique combinations of capabilities and characteristics that made them genuinely irreplaceable when those combinations were exceptional. A contradiction that the Middleton family's crisis following Josiah's death made visible in ways that challenged comfortable assumptions about slavery's economic rationality and about the adequacy of treating human beings as commodities that markets could readily replace. And sometimes, according to stories that were preserved across generations by those who had witnessed events or who had heard accounts from people who worked in Charleston's commercial districts during the years when one man's extraordinary capabilities generated wealth that enriched others, while he received only subsistence that kept him capable of continuing to work. Slavery involved not just the systematic exploitation and brutal violence that characterized the institution's normal operations, but also economic dependencies that developed when particular individuals possessed capabilities that made them essentially irreplaceable despite the system's ideology that insisted human beings were fungible property, whose loss could be readily compensated through market purchases. Creating situations where families who claimed ownership discovered that their economic security had become dependent on someone whose death revealed uncomfortable truths about how valuable enslaved people's labor actually was, and about how inadequate the compensation that slavery provided truly was when measured against the wealth that such labor generated for others. The man who stood 7 feet 6 inches tall and whose labor generated perhaps $6,000 in revenues across 13 years, while he received only minimal subsistence worth perhaps a few $100s over that same period, demonstrated through both his life and the crisis that his death created that slavery's economic foundations rested on systematic exploitation of extraordinary value while providing grossly inadequate compensation. That the ideology of fungibility concealed the reality that exceptional individuals could not be replaced through any market mechanisms, and that acknowledging these truths too explicitly threatened to expose contradictions that the system's defenders needed to keep obscured in order to maintain the comfortable rationalizations that allowed them to continue participating in an institution whose fundamental injustice became undeniable when examined with the kind of clarity that a man's irreplaceability and a family's extended financial crisis made impossible to avoid for anyone willing to see what such circumstances revealed about slavery's operations beneath the surface of legal theories. And economic ideologies that insisted human beings were property equivalent to any other capital asset that markets could readily replace.